Remember that the Latinos who came here were much closer to the African matrix than were even the African Americans who were here.
Slave buyers and merchants had a definite hierarchy of desirable African ethnicities. Gambians were at the top of the list, both in the Chesapeake and in South Carolina. One reason was that the voyage from that northernmost part of the West African slaving territory was significantly shorter than from farther south, and there was less time for the captives to sicken and die. As Ringgold IV put it in a letter, Gambia the best and generally comes in best health as the passage is quick from thence to this place. Though the passage surely seemed to last an eternity for those chained in the hold. The cultivation of tobacco was well suited to Senegambians' existing agricultural skills. Conveniently, they were at the time easy to get, an availability that peaked in the first 3 decades of the 18th century, as intra-African conflicts in that region threw war captives onto the market. The Bambara, the Wolof, the Mandinka, the Fulani. They brought with them not only agricultural skills, but all kinds of cultural skills, including music. They brought the banjo and a bowed fiddle, the latter a specialty of the nomadic Fulani, which they used to play a highly ornamented dance music. They brought a sense of swing, in which pairs of notes were not of equal length, but were long, short. They brought a bardic poetic tradition that informed their way of singing, and, not least, they brought a centuries-old history of contact with Islam. The musical styles of the Muslim world affected their way of playing music greatly, and aspects of it, melisma, pitch bending, and heterophony, a loose sense of unison, would surface in a new African-American music. Senegambians were early populators of all three major African-American cultural areas, the Chesapeake, the Low Country, and Louisiana. But there were people from all 7 of the major slaving regions of West and Central Africa, and perhaps a few from the 8th, Southeast Africa, in Chesapeake society.
You ask me to write my life. I cannot write my life, for I have forgotten much of my talk as well as the talk of the Arabs. Oh brother, in the name of Allah, I ask you not to blame me, for my eye is weak as well as my body.
Omar ibn Said was a famous and a scholarly African-American Muslim who came here in the early 1800s. What Omar ibn Said's manuscript shows that he was a scholar. He was a world's traveler before he was even captured and enslaved.
It is the only known existing manuscript in Arabic written by a slave. And it's written by a man who is still a slave. He arrived when he was 37. He died, he was over 80. Over a period of 40 years, he knew English. In Arabic, he knew that no one could understand what he said. And therefore, he could be more truthful, if you want, less fearful.
The fact that these materials are written in Arabic sort of changes what we believe we know about American slavery and about those individuals who were enslaved in America. In a typical classroom, when students are introduced to American slavery, there's a section in their textbook, and that section in their textbook may or may not introduce many details about specific individuals. So I think part of what this collection does is it lends an original voice that we've never heard before to a story that we thought we knew.
It opens a window into 200 years ago. What was West Africa like? Who were the people who were on that continent? So we begin asking new questions, the questions about the lives of those slaves before they became slaves.
My name is Omar ibn Said. My birthplace, Futa, between the two rivers.
He was born in an area which was between two rivers, probably what is Senegal today. And there he grows up and he studies. So he says, I spent 26 years studying. And you say, okay, what was he studying? He doesn't elaborate. One has to assume that he went beyond reading and writing to doing much more.
And then they came to our country, a big army. It killed many people. It took me and walked me to the big sea and sold me in the hand of a Christian man.
There was tribal warfare in the region, and he is caught. And then he is sold into slavery. He is sold to merchants who were buying slaves. And he is then put on a ship. And he sails for 6 weeks.
He also talked about his experience when he arrived here, making it into what he called Charlestown, and being badgered and misused and abused. to the point that he had to escape.
So they captured him and they put him in jail. And so he stays there, and he's alone in a room, and he begins writing on the wall. He begins writing. And he writes in Arabic, because that's the language he knew. He could not understand what people were saying around him.
And they was curious about this guy, they wrote this writing. They thought that the Africans had no culture, no history, couldn't read and write. Omar ibn Said dispels that. He could read, he could write, and he was very scholarly.
On Friday, a man came and opened the door of the jail, and I saw many men whose language was Christian. They called to me, "Is your name not Omar? Is it not Said?" I did not understand the Christian language.
He refers to them as the Owens, and they are, one of them turns out to be the governor of North Carolina. And he takes him in, and then he says that there were good men who believed in God, who had the Bible, and who read to him the Bible.
Anywhere from 25 to 28% of the population that was brought here were Muslims. The same prophets that we find in the Quran, we find in the Bible. So he was able to intertwine, interrelate those experiences.
But when he writes his biography, he begins with a verse from the Quran. And the verse from the Quran is, again, a very interesting choice. It is the verse which refers to domination, which refers to ownership, Surat al-Mulk. And in Islam, all ownership belongs to God. God is the only owner. It can be understood as a criticism of the whole institution of slavery. And he does this in the subtle way of saying, you really have no right to own another human being.
They robbed their culture, they robbed their identity, they disconnected them from family. There was no connection.
I reside in our country because of the great harm. The infidels took me unjustly and sold me.
It's one of those stories that will always be relevant. Today, around the world, there are tens of millions of people who are enslaved. So Omar ibn Said humanizes the experience of a person in his own words.
If this is a voice we've never heard of before, and these materials have been out there, what other materials exist? What other stories can we help uncover? And how can those stories together help us better understand an episode of our nation's past that maybe we don't understand as thoroughly as we ought to?
There's a lot of insights that can be pulled out of it if people take it not with bigotry in their heart or arrogance in their heart, but to look for the insight. You see concrete, grass come up out of concrete, or trees grow up out of concrete. So out of the concrete of enslavement, you found positive Muslim personalities rising out. Things will get better, things will be better, and that's what they represent, hope that things will get better.
He was one of the very last Africans to be taken into slavery in the United States, and the only known African Muslim to have left an autobiography in Arabic about his years in captivity while he was still a slave. In 1807, Omar ibn Said, a 37-year-old Muslim scholar, was captured by an invading African army in Senegal and sold to slave traders. He was taken from his village in Fouta Toro to St. Louis port, where he was sold into slavery. St. Louis is an island at the mouth of the Senegal River that played an important role in the transit of slaves from African countries to the Americas and the Caribbean. This region was one of the main sectors of the so-called triangular trade, which consisted of Europeans coming to West Africa to exchange manufactured goods, like textiles and weapons, in return for slaves. Then the enslaved Africans were loaded onto boats and taken to the Americas, after which the boats would return back to Europe loaded with raw materials like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These transatlantic crossings saw at least 10 to 12 million people being transported to the Americas as slaves from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Only the stories of a few have been preserved, and Ibn Said's is one of them. Ibn Said was taken into slavery in 1807, a year before the abolishment of the slave trade took effect in the US, and died in 1864, just 1 year before slavery was finally abolished. His story has come to prominence 150 years after his death, when his memoir was added to the US Library of Congress in 2017. Before Ibn Said's abduction, he was an intellectual who spent more than 2 decades of his life studying the Quran and other subjects in his home country. Throughout 15 handwritten pages, Ibn Said's memoir challenges the historical slave narrative about African traditions and culture. His memoir begins with a chapter from the Quran, Surah Al-Mulk, with the verses speaking about dominion, sovereignty or ownership, and the conveying of an overarching message that only God has ownership of creation. The verses, according to experts, could be understood as a message to the slave owners and slave culture prevalent at the time. Then Ibn Said proceeds to tell his own story.
My name is Umar ibn Said. My birthplace was Fouta Toro, between the two rivers. I sought knowledge under the instruction of a sheikh called Muhammad Said, my own brother Sheikh Suleiman Kembe, and Sheikh Gabriel Abdal. I continued my studies 25 years, and then returned to my home where I remained for 6 years. Then there came to our place a large army, who killed many men and took me and brought me to the Great Sea, and sold me into the hands of the Christians, who bound me, sent me on board a great ship, and we sailed upon the Great Sea a month and a half, when we came to a place called Charleston in the Christian language. There they sold me to a small, weak and wicked man called Johnson, a complete infidel who had no fear of God at all.
Ibn Said eventually ran away from his first owner in Charleston, South Carolina, to Fayetteville, North Carolina, before he was arrested and sold again. But this time, according to his memoir, his new owner, James Owen, was different. Historians who studied Ibn Said's memoir and other documents are of the opinion that Ibn Said spent the rest of his life with the Owen family, who were affiliated with the American Colonization Society, a group that was formed in 1817 to send free African Americans to Africa as an alternative to emancipation in the United States. The group sent thousands of Africans to Liberia.
Between the northern abolitionists and the southern slave plantation owners, there was a middle way, as they called it, and that middle way was colonization, namely convincing as many slave owners to release slaves or buying them and then sending them to Liberia. And those particular people were not universally, it seems, interested in all slaves. They were particularly drawn to men of culture and education, like Omar was.
Ibn Said's skills and intellect made him a well-known person in the entourage, and when he died, a local newspaper published an obituary praising him as a pious Christian, which was unusual in 19th century America. Which takes us to another point that makes Ibn Said's memoir remarkable. Although Ibn Said wrote in his memoir that he converted to Christianity, experts analyzing his memoir say otherwise.
It's one of the things that a number of Muslims did, that's pseudo-conversion. In some countries, they were just forced, and they externally, if you will, conform to that. And then, they actually remain Muslims.
The fact that the opacity of his narrative when he opens it, for example, by a particular surah from the Quran that seemed to me to be included as a kind of a message, a hidden message, that his owners had no right over him, that the possession and power all inheres in the hands of God. That this seemed to be to kind of go against the narrative of his conversion, right, or of his slavery itself.
But whether his conversion was real or was a facade for protection like many enslaved Africans in the 19th century, Ibn Said's memoir stands as an important document for the history and narrative of African heritage in the United States.
The whole operation of the slave trade depended upon willfully neglecting the origins of enslavement. And that's one of the reasons why a text like Omar's is so important, because it recovers that suppressed history. And slavery is a silencer. It denies the voices of captive Africans and enslaved people in the Americas. So recovering this text is so important to getting that history back and understanding the lies and violence that were really at the root of the Atlantic slave trade.
To work as a slave. His name was Mamadou Yaro, and he was a Muslim. He was painted in 1819 by the famous Revolutionary War portrait artist Charles Willson Peale. This man who painted presidents decided he wanted to paint a picture of Yaro.
To pay that kind of attention to a formerly enslaved black man, this is unheard of.
When I first heard about an enslaved Muslim or an emancipated Muslim, I was like, what do you mean? Like, I didn't think that, Muslims were in the US until later.
Even though we have a lot of evidence, the story of the African Muslims in the United States has been, for the longest time, lost, unknown.
I didn't really even know about the story when I was growing up here as an adult.
This is a story that predates the founding of America.
Predates the founding of America.
Much of Mamadou Yaro's story takes place in and around Washington, D.C., a city that's been my home for several years. As a Muslim born and raised in the United States, I've always been curious about the roots of Islam in our country. I knew the first Muslims to arrive here in significant numbers came from Africa, but I didn't realize how much of their story had been unearthed.
It appears as if between 10 to 15%, some say even 30% of the enslaved Africans came from Muslim parts of West Africa.
Thousands of Muslims were enslaved in the Americas, including what became the United States.
They were part of the social and cultural and economic development of the Americas for half a millennium.
We now know that some African Muslims left their names, preserved in plantation records and runaway slave ads. Others left their writings. A few left their image. Among them was Mamadou Yaro, also known as Yaro Mahmoud. He was painted not once, but twice. It's one of the things that makes him stand out.
He gives us a story of what it was like to gain freedom and then live after that and practice as a free person. I don't think we have any other story like that.
Yaro's story has been preserved in the archives of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, in the writings of the artist who first painted him, after painting presidents, including George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson.
We are looking at one of 26 diaries written by Charles Willson Peale, a very important early American portrait painter, one of the most important. This diary goes back to 1818 to early 1819. The diary is rather small, as you can see. It's about 58 pages of text. The Yaro section takes up about 3.5 pages. It's the biggest vignette in the diary from this period.
Writing in December 1818, Peale describes a visit to D.C. where he heard about an old African man, Yarrow, living in Georgetown in surprising circumstances.
Mr. Brewer said that he is comfortable in his situation, having bank stock, and lives in his own house. I shall be able to give a more...
I shall be able to give a more particular account of him as I propose to make a portrait of him, should I have the opportunity of doing it.
The diary was a vital resource for the author, who played a key role in piecing Yarrow's story together, drawing on Peale's account and a wide variety of other sources, from census data to shipping records.
I was here at this library many years ago, and I saw this painting by James Alexander Simpson. Georgetown is a lily white community, and so to see a painting of a black man at this library was sort of unusual. That's what started the whole project.
Where did Yarrow come from exactly?
We don't know for sure, but he was a Fulani Muslim, and the Fulani were moving from Mali into Senegal, Guinea, and other places in West Africa at the time.
Islam comes to Africa itself via the trans-Saharan trade routes and over North Africa down into West Africa.
Islam was implanted in Africa for over 1,000 years. The spread of Islam went hand in hand with the spread of literacy in Arabic. So there were schools for boys and girls. There were also institutions of higher learning, and they traveled all over, not only West Africa, but to Mecca, to Egypt, to learn.
They also are interested in not necessarily being Arab, as it were, but practicing Islam through this African sensibility.
This was the world Mamadou Yarrow knew until he reached his teens, when everything changed. Around 1750, Yarrow and his sister were sold to British slave traders after being captured, probably in a local war.
He's in a center of Islamic learning, and then boom, just like that, he becomes a captive of the slave trade. And he becomes one of the estimated 12.5 million people that from 1525 to about 1867 were taken from Africa to the New World.
Yarrow and his sister survived the notorious Middle Passage, a grueling journey across the Atlantic that took several months. The ship Elijah carried them to Annapolis, Maryland, where in the summer of 1752, brother and sister were put up for sale, advertised in a local paper as pieces of property.
This is a page from the Maryland Gazette, a weekly newspaper published in those days.
So it says, just imported in the Elijah, directly from the coast of Africa.
A parcel of healthy slaves consisting of men, women, and children. So they're bringing children over as well.
And it will be, is it?
Disposed of on board the said vessel.
For sterling money, bills of exchange, gold or paper currency.
Yarrow and his sister were separated in Annapolis. What became of her is unclear, but Yarrow was enslaved on a tobacco plantation in Montgomery County, now the suburbs of Washington, D.C. In the decades that followed, records suggest he had a son here with an enslaved woman. Around 1790,
while slave owners in the British colonies were largely resistant to converting these African peoples in the first century of the trade, for fear it would cause them to press for their freedom, the goal of evangelical preachers became converting as many souls as possible, even black souls. Incredibly, 210,000 Africans were brought here to the Carolinas and Georgia, nearly 50% of them arriving through the port of Charleston. Today, off the coast of Georgia, we can find some of the deepest traces of Christianity in places like Sapelo Island, home to the Gullah Geechee people. But the Muslim religion's strong roots persisted as well. Islam survived in ways that creolized Black Christianity.
During the 20s and 30s, people descended on Sapelo, researchers and writers who were also looking for the African origins of Black culture. The missing link, right? So the stories that they told contributed to a wealth of knowledge about the existence of Black Muslims on Georgia's coast.
What happened to the descendants of the Muslims who were here? Are you descended from a Muslim?
I am, actually. I mean, but most people from Sapelo are also descendants.
So the practice of Islam did not last very long within the community. Soon people were converted to Christianity.
There was a time where there were people who seemed to remember that there might be specific traditions that might be associated with Islam, burial practices, you know, where graves are facing.
There's a lot of east to west orientation that I've seen.
One of the things that I think that is the story of Black religion in America is that what enslaved people did in this new context was they attempted to merge and, you know, fuse these different worlds that they lived in.
Melissa is a descendant of Bilali Muhammad, who was brought to the island in the early 1800s, one of the many devout Muslims captured and enslaved in Senegambia. A quarter of the ancestors of African Americans came from this region. Bilali testified to his beliefs in a book of letters, written in his own hand.
He left a written record of both his attempts to reclaim and recall what he was remembering of his religious instruction.
In other words, he was determined to preserve his identity, this aspect of his identity.
Exactly, exactly. So, you know, this was Bilali's daughter, and her sons would become very instrumental in the creation of First African Baptist Church on the island.
In 1930, Katie Brown, a former slave and the great-granddaughter of Bilali Muhammad, recalled her own religious awakening as a young child.
When I heard the old people singing, it made me feel like I ought to be a Christian. And I prayed and I prayed till I got my religion.
Throughout the 18th century, the dramatically expanding transatlantic slave trade shipped more and more Africans of different ethnic backgrounds to what would become the United States, creating a melting pot of African cultures and religious beliefs. It was in the colony of Maryland that Job Ben Solomon's remarkable story unfolded, but it began across the ocean in West Africa.
One of the famous Muslims in the United States was Job Ben Salomon, as he was known here, but his name was Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. And he was born in the Islamic state of Futa Toro in Senegal.
Job Ben Salomon was an educated Muslim. He participated in the slave trade and was a trader himself.
In 1730, during an excursion into the Gambia River region to sell captives, he found himself captured and was taken aboard a slave ship and transported to Maryland.
Imprisoned for attempting to run away, Job penned a letter in Arabic addressed to his father in Africa. Incredibly, the letter ended up in the hands of James Oglethorpe, the founder of the colony of Georgia, who had it translated. Astonished to learn that Job was from a prominent Muslim family, Oglethorpe arranged for the Royal African Company to purchase his freedom and send him to London, where he became an overnight celebrity, celebrated by British royalty.
He stayed 2 years in London, where he met the king, and his portrait was done. And when his portrait was made, he was wearing European clothes, but he did not want to be immortalized in that. And he described to the painter his country clothes. So he's painted in his Islamic clothes. For him, his honor was as a Muslim and an African.
Finally, in 1734, he returned to Senegal as an employee of the Royal African Company, where he purchased 2 horses and, ironically, an enslaved person of his own. A fascinating example of the relationship between freedom and literacy, Joe Ben Solomon's story also illuminates an important dimension about our African ancestors. Their religious beliefs weren't monolithic. They practiced traditional African religions, as well as Islam and Christianity.
Islam.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Like Abdul, more and more people of all ethnicities are finding their way to Islam. A third of all Muslims in America, about 2 million, are converts. The people at the mosque in Jackson are convinced that this is having a positive impact on the entire nation. Okolo Rashid is one of the founding members here.
We're happy to have you. We heard so much about you. Yes, your
I hope
show.
all good.
All good, and we're just happy to have you.
Okolo is involved in a new research project with 25 other historians. They believe their discoveries will not only rewrite the history of Islam in America, but transform our understanding of African cultures.
I think we're leading the way, actually.
As part of this initiative, Okolo founded the International Museum of Muslim Cultures, the first in America. Research here suggests the number of Muslim slaves was much greater than previously thought.
1/3 of all of the enslaved Africans that were brought to the Americas actually were Muslims. Nobody knows this. This is kind of new cutting-edge information because when we read our history books, we don't see that. We have one of the great stories here in Mississippi, in a place called Natchez, Mississippi. We have the story of Prince Abdul Rahman Ibrahim. He was an African Muslim prince and scholar. Came out of the area around Gambia, and he was actually enslaved in Natchez for over 40 years. And we have that story.
But you're a combination of all these things that's unique here to the Deep South, aren't you? I mean, Africa, American, and Muslim. And why is it important to stress, I mean, in this exhibit, in your work, this missing link of Islam in this mix?
The most important reason is that it's going to help the African American to become a first-class citizen as opposed to a second-class citizen. And this whole standing up for rights, fight for freedom, leading the whole effort in America for reforming America and bringing America to respect its own constitution, or blending, is really that's what makes me optimistic about the future.
This corner of the exhibition is really interesting because you've got real evidence of this link between Islam and slavery in Mississippi. And Ibrahim Abdurrahman, who was known as the prince among slaves, who was sold into slavery for 40 years before winning his freedom and going to live as a free man in Liberia. And I understand that there are...
Prince Among Slaves, a 60-minute documentary, tells the story of an African prince who was enslaved in Mississippi in the late 18th century.
I was born Abdul Rahman. My father was Sori, king of Fujajalon.
Many years ago, on the west coast of Africa, I was saved by an African prince.
You're saying my prince actually is an African prince?
Ayohalahu, Al-Habib, Al-Qari.
They had a constitution, they had laws. This was a very sophisticated society.
Someone brought up in Fujajalon believes that on the day you're born, God knows and numbers every day of your life. And
This fight, however cruel it seemed to him, was part of a divine plan.
It dawned on him that he is no longer a prince. He's no longer a warrior. From that point onwards, his dignity was based on his ability to master the circumstances that he was in.
Isabella.
I want you to show her how we work the fields here in Mississippi.
Yes, sir.
And where did you learn to read Arabic?
I learned as a boy in Timbo and Timbuktu.
Finally, through near providential circumstances, he negotiates his freedom with the ruler of the country that holds him captive. His royal status is recognized in the land that enslaved him.
This was a man who has a lot of faith, and he's committed to his principles, but he knows how to get what he wants from the system.
In order to do that, he has to tell a story that makes sense to the people he's talking to. So we don't know how much of what he said was just for them and how much was what he really thought in his own heart, because he wasn't a fool.
If you have faith, you will think that all of this happened for a reason that you don't know. But ultimately, things will get better.
This biography is perhaps the best researched story of an enslaved African in American history, and yet is largely unknown until now.
From Africa to America, toiling in the fields. From Africa to America, whipped to meet the yields. From Africa to America, freed but still not free. From Africa to America, Allah brings true liberty.
I think what we have to say really with respect to the connective between the Portuguese presence in Africa, south of the Sahara, through the explorations organized by Prince Henry the Navigator, and the emergence of Muslim slaves in the New World, is that during this period, the evidence seemed to point to the fact that there was credible Islamic presence in sub-Saharan Africa during the European penetration. And this is very evident in the writings of Portuguese writers themselves, because the Portuguese themselves talks about marabouts. People like Alves de Cadamosto, the Portuguese writer, and people like Cabral and Pereira. These were Portuguese writers, navigators who came to that part of Africa. And they captured in their memoirs and in their narratives of their journeys the presence of Muslims. Now, during the slave trade, some of those Muslims found themselves as slaves in the Americas. And we can identify and describe these places and the individuals who were taken to that area.
It is estimated that 30% of the slaves imported from Africa belonged to the Islamic faith. We are presenting a few examples of these Muslim slaves and their struggle to gain freedom from their masters. It was a great tragedy that these people, being the bearers of the most enlightened civilization of its time through Islam, were reduced to slavery by the Europeans. Unfortunately, Muslim slaves became the victims of the prevailing European status quo of the time. European traders believed all Africans to be uncivilized people and were sadly bereft of the knowledge that Islam had ruled the entire West, Central, and Eastern Africa for more than 800 years. They could not appreciate that their African captives were highly civilized people who were scholars and responsible officials in a great number of fields of expertise.
For example, in the United States, we know that there was an African prince who was a a Hafiz al-Quran by the name of Ayyub ibn Sulaiman Jallo. Now, if you are familiar with African anthropology and African history, you know precisely who this man is, because he was a prince from Bondo, and he was the son of an African king from Bondo, which is now part of Senegal and Guinea area. That kingdom would embrace portions of Guinea and Senegal. And of course, his story was well known. That's one reason why Douglas Grant has a book by the name The Fortunate Slave, because he was one of the very few slaves who was able to obtain his freedom and went back home in Africa. Now, if you read Douglas Grant's book, The Fortunate Slave, you will see clearly what happened to Ayyub ibn Sulaiman Jallo. He was a slave in Annapolis, Maryland, 50 miles from Washington, D.C. And of course, he was a Hafiz al-Quran because he was able to write the Quran from memory. That shows you the level of scholarship that existed at that time in certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa.
Here is the portrait of Yaro Mahmoud, an African Muslim slave who lived in the Georgetown, Washington, D.C. area in approximately 1819. The portrait was painted by an American artist, Charles Wilson Peale, who wrote about Yaro Mahmoud in his diary. Yaro was a slave of the Bell family in Georgetown and was finally freed because of his piety, integrity, and hard work. Yaro, as a free man, lived to be 100 years old when this portrait was painted. He owned his own house, and he would walk on the streets singing loudly in praise of Allah. He was modestly dressed and observed the Islamic dietary rules. He did not drink alcohol or eat pork. He successfully maintained his identity as a Muslim in spite of the pressures upon him from the Christian masters to convert to Christianity. The Prince of Slaves. Abdul Rahman Ibrahim, known as the Prince of Slaves, was the son of Sori, the king of Timbo, which in the present day is the land of Guinea in Africa. As a child, he was educated in Quranic schools and then later sent to Timbuktu for advanced studies in Islam. In 1781, at the age of 17, he joined his father's army and became a military hero. He was captured and brought to New Orleans, and then to Natchez, Mississippi, where he was purchased by Thomas Foster, a tobacco and cotton farmer, on April 21, 1788. Ibrahim remained in slavery for 40 years, married a black woman, and had children. He never forgot his Muslim traditions during this entire period. He knew Arabic very well and could recite the Holy Quran and prayed 5 times a day. He impressed his master with his piety and dignity so much that he was appointed as the head of all the slaves in the plantation. When the news reached the ruler of Morocco that Ibrahim was a royal family member, the Moroccan ruler requested his freedom. Ibrahim was freed in 1828 by his master when Secretary of State Henry Clay interceded on his behalf. After his freedom, he left for his homeland to meet his relatives. Sadly, Ibrahim could not reach his homeland of Fouta Jalon. He died on his way at the age of 67. He remained a believer in Islam till his death, in spite of the pressures from his Christian masters to convert him to the Christian religion and to preach Christianity in Africa. On March 3, 1753, Muslims from North Africa appear in the records of a South Carolina Council Journal, number 21, page 289 to 299. Slaves Abel Konder and Mahmoud petitioned the authorities for freedom in Arabic. They had been owned by Daniel LaRoche for 15 years when they petitioned for freedom from the authorities again, and they won. In 1767, Kunta Kint was in Maryland as a slave. His constant struggle to keep up his Islamic beliefs was remarkable. These people were silent but devout believers in Islam, afraid of their masters but pretending to be Christians at the forced bidding of their masters. In 1768, 9 Muslim slaves, one of them a slave of David Anderson of South Carolina, wrote chapters from the Holy Quran in Arabic. Hodgson was among the first American scholars to explore the Islamic heritage of the slaves and did extensive research on the subject in Africa.
Good Lord, show me the
Omar ibn Said, 1770 to 1864, was a descendant from an Arab family in West Africa. He lived in the land which is the present-day Senegal. He came to America as a slave in 1807. All his life he put up a great struggle to remain a Muslim. His language was Arabic, and he was well educated in the Quran. He used to write letters in Arabic to his friends in Africa. At one time he was asked by his master to write a Christian prayer for a church. He pretended to be a Christian and wrote a surah from the Holy Quran in Arabic and recited it. The people in the church thought he was singing a Christian song. However, it was a passage from the Holy Quran. The following are some of his Arabic writings. His master gave him a Bible written in Arabic.
Even amongst the African Americans, that were the slave people, that there was many Muslims amongst them. Some of the famous personalities that I spoke earlier, Bilali Muhammad, Salih Bilali. Then you had Omar ibn Zaid, who was a famous, I would say, griot, because he was a storyteller. He lived to be a ripe old age, somewhat of a fortunate life. He was a storyteller in Fayetteville area, Fayetteville, North Carolina. Then there's other personalities, such as, I mentioned Yar Mahmoud, the famous businessman, Omar ibn Zaid, Muhammad ibn Zaid. Then there was one less known one that fought in the Revolutionary War. His name is Yusuf bin Ali, and he fought with General Sumter in the Sumter, South Carolina area. And their descendants were known as Turks. And there's back in the 1970s, the Turkish president at the time came down and met the people, recognized that it wasn't Turks, but they was misclassified because at that time the Ottoman Empire was in rule. But his family name became Joseph bin Heli, but he was a famous Revolutionary War hero that fought with General Sumter, and they're in the Sumter, South Carolina area now. We also talking about Sumter, South Carolina. We also find that Muslims, and I'm sorry I didn't speak about it earlier, Muslims were also brought over here during the Barbary Coast Wars, with Morocco being the first country to acknowledge America's freedom and independence back in 1787, I believe. There was a peace treaty that was signed. Matter of fact, there was two of them. One is the Peace Treaty of Friendship, and within this peace treaty, they signed it on the Delaware River. With this peace treaty, they established a friendship. Now, some of the signatures on that peace treaty was Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, some of the founding fathers of this country. And they had a relationship with many of these North African countries to try to help establish this peace treaty. Okay, in America, amongst the Muslim slaves, we found many of these Arabic writings. Bilal bin Ali's 1829 13-page Risala, housed in University of Athens, Georgia. Ibrahim Abdul Sori and his 1828 letter, saying we came from Timbuktu and other places in his education. And then Omar ibn Zaid, that we talked about earlier, he's the most prolific, or has left majority of the Arabic writings that we found amongst the Muslim slaves. And this one right here is one of his writings that was done in 1857, and it's Surah 110. And he had the opportunity to recite this in church. That he, being a Muslim in America, he's been able to blend both of them together, Christianity and Islam. That a lot of times, because in the Quran you find many same prophets, same ayah, same surahs that we find in the Bible, and Omar was able to blend them together. Omar been known that Omar was a Sufi and a well-known scholar. He's one of the better and higher scholars that was here in America. And this is his Arabic writing in 1857.
Resist their enslavement and pursue their freedom. They left numerous written accounts of their experiences in America in the form of letters, diaries, and autobiographies, most of them in Arabic. Omar ibn Said penned an autobiography in 1831, the only known autobiography of an enslaved person in a native African language. They also wrote pages of Arabic for their enslavers and other members of white society, like the American Colonization Society. But instead of writing what the recipients believed was a Bible verse or the Lord's Prayer, they wrote Quranic verses, made genealogical lists, and even pleaded to return home to Africa. They also blended Islam and Christianity. For example, they combined the Basmala and Lord's Prayer in documents, and they inscribed Islam into Christian spaces, such as etching Surah An-Nas into a pew at the First African Church of Savannah. This final chapter of the Quran is meant as a protection, in this case symbolically used against their enslavers. Enslaved Muslims also created objects to practice their faith. In the 1730s, Ayuba Suleiman Diallo wrote multiple copies of the Quran from memory for use in devotion and education. And the WPA narratives, a series of interviews conducted in the 1930s and 40s with formerly enslaved persons and their descendants, are filled with references to other important objects of religious practice, namely beads called tasbih and prayer mats. As Katie Brown, the great-granddaughter of Bilali Muhammad, who was enslaved on Sapelo Island, Georgia, recalls, quote, Bilali and his wife Phoebe pray on the bead. They bow to the sun and have a little mat to kneel on. The beads is on a long string. Bilali he pull bead and he say, Bilambi Hakabara Muhammadu. Phoebe she say, Amin, Amin, end quote. However, enslaved African Muslims also experienced open hostility and hardship when practicing their faith. Ayuba Suleiman Diallo was pelted with dirt by a white boy in Kent Island, Maryland, as he prayed. Others were forced to wear sacrilegious clothing, abandon dietary rules and religious fasting, or abstain from the required daily prayers. An unnamed Moorish slave in Louisiana confirmed this hardship in 1822 when he, quote, lamented that his situation as a slave in America prevents him from obeying the dictates of his religion, unquote. Nevertheless, they persevered and lived their faith. Some became pseudo-converts to Christianity in order to protect themselves and their families or secure their freedom. Lamin Kebi pretended to convert to Christianity to secure passage back to Africa through the American Colonization Society in 1834. However, after returning to Africa, Kebi disappeared into Sierra Leone, surely, quote, still retaining his Mohammedan creed, end quote. The Islam initially brought to America by enslaved Africans did not survive many generations, but it left traces and traditions that are still visible today. The practice of ring shout, a form of religious dance in which men and women rotate counterclockwise while singing, clapping their hands, and shuffling their feet, may have been inherited from enslaved Muslims such as Bilali Muhammad and Salia Bilali in the Georgia Sea Islands. The movement mimics the ritual circling of the Kaaba in Mecca by Muslim pilgrims, called tawaf, and the name shout may come from the Arabic shout, meaning a single run. The WPA narratives also contain reminiscences of rice cakes called saraka, which were handed out during rituals and feast days. From the Arabic word sadaqah, or free will offering, this charity is an aspect of zakat, one of the pillars of Islam. And early blues singers, like those recorded by ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax in Levy Camp Holler, employed singing styles reminiscent of the adhan, or call to prayer.
You can always help them.
They use sweeping and extended vocalizations to fill the words with intense emotions. Enslaved Muslims were brought to the United States with distinct cultural and religious beliefs, caught in the middle of complicated social and legal attitudes from the very moment they landed on America's Atlantic shores. They succeeded in forming networks and communities, and they maintained their religious identity despite overwhelming odds. The material culture enslaved Muslims left behind, books, writings, clothing, beads, and rugs, and the traditions they cultivated help tell their stories today. Islam has always been an important religion in America. It's essential to develop a national conversation that fosters and augments our collective memory of these men, women, and children. One that honors how the call to prayer has been sounding from sea to shining sea for more than 500 years.
أشهد أن لا